Let me say at the outset that I'm glad, and I'm not surprised, and I'm glad at the same time that you don't see this development, the current events, as simply a binary between Putin and Zelensky. Because when Professor Girish Kumar sent to me the notice, I saw on the picture of Putin and Zelensky. This is not a Russia-Ukraine binary. That we have to understand that right at the outset, that confusion is there in the minds of a lot of people, because if that confusion persists, then you don't get a correct perspective on what is taking place today. But the narrative that Professor Girish Kumar said is by and large putting matters in perspective, except one place where I must also add something which is very of critical importance, that at the time of the German unification towards 1990, 89, 90, the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, the background. The way forward was being choreographed. And at that time, and I was in the embassy at that time as minister counselor in the embassy in Moscow. So I have some familiarity with this subject also. That, when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded, it's important to remember that it was a unilateral decision by the Soviet Union, because it just didn't have the financial capacity to bear the burden of an alliance system. And at that time, when the Western world came to know about it, they were aghast that Gorbachev was on this step. Margaret Thatcher, who was British Prime Minister, and François Mitterrand, French President, rushed to Moscow, in fact, to plead with Gorbachev not to do that the Western world is not ready. This is an important point to remember, because in the mythology that subsequently developed after the Cold War, there is a notion that the West defeated the Warsaw Pact system, and Warsaw Pact it was not like that. Warsaw Pact's disbandment and the end of the Cold War was actually a negotiated settlement. This is a fundamental importance that we should understand this. Of course, some Western historians and Western diplomats who had Jack Matlock, for instance, who was the ambassador at that time when I was in the embassy at Moscow, and who had a hands-on role in this transition from Cold War era to the post-Cold War era, and is known to me and has even narrated to me so many details about this later, has written a wonderful book on this, actually, which would be of interest to the students. Reagan, Gorbachev, and the end of the Cold War. A wonderful book, first-hand knowledge of it. You should read it, the students particularly, if you have not. Now, this is important to know, and they came and Thatcher and Mitterrand came to Gorbachev to plead with him that don't do this, we are not ready. Because the unspoken question there was actually Germany. German question was the real crucial issue in the 20th century. We know that. It caused 2 wars. Where are the borders of Germany after the unification by Bismarck? This was the root of the European crisis, the German question. So again, it suddenly popped up. The Western world was not ready. And again, it is popping up now also, which I will come to a little later. Why? It is because Germany has that kind of what Bernard Shaw would call life force. It could become a giant too big for the European continent to tackle. It happened twice. A third time, the Western world need to prepare, because an inevitable consequence of the end of the Cold War would be the unification of Germany. The Western world, Western leaderships understood that. So a lot of people flocked to. Those were times when almost every week there were some Western statesmen or the other coming to see Gorbachev to discuss this. They were so perturbed about the uncertainties that were lying ahead. And the German question, the German unification question came to the top. The Berlin Wall collapsed and the German unification question came up. So then what do you do with Germany? That was the question. Germany was a member of the NATO alliance system, but when GDR joins it and the unified Germany comes up, it becomes a much bigger entity with much greater potential in future. Does it remain within NATO? If it is not within NATO, great uncertainty ahead. So it was primarily decided that it would stay within NATO. Gorbachev said that Russia can live with it, Germany within it, but on the basis of certain conditions, that the NATO system itself should not pose any further threat to Soviet Union stroke Russia. Now, this was acceded to by the Western leaders. In fact, the first guarantee was given by James Baker, the then United States Secretary of State. Then Genscher, you may have heard the name, very familiar statesman. He gave, then the French and the British and everyone gave this assurance that, and Baker's promise was that exact words from the archives of various foreign ministries which are available now, and Georgetown University's National Archives has got all these cables and documents and so on. So you can read it. I'm not giving you an original idea. It's that, quote unquote, that NATO wouldn't expand an inch eastward if Gorbachev agreed to German unification. And for Germany, it was such a dream that it could unify the nation again, So Kohl came one day to meet Gorbachev with this, to try to persuade him, and he persuaded him, and Gorbachev agreed. And later, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of West Germany, later he wrote that whole night he couldn't sleep because that was the kind of emotion going through in his mind that his nation was going to be unified again. And he said, and he wrote that he was walking the streets of Moscow because he couldn't sleep. So you must put matters in perspective. But then, after that, what happened is the rift between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, the attempted coup and Yeltsin's takeover and the collapse of the Soviet Union, or rather the disbandment of the Soviet Union by Yeltsin against American wishes, against American advice, and this American ambassador, Jack Matlock, was the person who did that, tried to stop the dissolution of the Soviet Union. These are all facts. You must read his book for that reason. So all this were taking place at that time in a compressed period of time of about, less than a year, So this part of it was never formalized in writing in a treaty. Europe has a long tradition from the time of Metternich in the beginning of the 19th century to when they wound up a war or a conflict situation or a confrontation, they invariably had put it all together in the form of treaties. Metternich was a great contribution there. Kissinger's thesis has done that. Now, on this assurance about the future of European security, there was no treaty written as such, bringing into it this assurance of the Western world to the Soviet Union, Russia. Now, this is the crux of the matter. Then in the Yeltsin years itself, after this, the Soviet Union collapsed, Yeltsin came to power, and the Russian policy was pronouncedly pro-Western. It was aspiring to be a part of the common European home and all that. And the disillusionment came later only, but I'm talking about the first half of the 1990s. Not really the first half, it was 2-3 years. But the Americans all along had no misconception that Russia would rise again. Because anyone actually with a knowledge of Russian history would know that it always rose again from the ashes like a phoenix. That happened time and again in Russian history. So the Americans knew that Russia's resurgence was a matter of time. Because, imagine the scope of that country, that nation, with infinite resources, human material resources, its geographical spread, across continents, 10, 11 time zones, staggering proportions. So, and a thermonuclear power. So you see the Clinton years, Clinton came to power in 1992. By 1992-93 itself, this thought began bothering the American mind. How do we prepare for the resurgence of Russia? So in other words, Russia's co-option into the Western system, the common European home, was never taken seriously by the Americans. They actually rejected it. They stood in the way of it, you know. So by about 92, 93, we have evidence from diplomatic archives that the Americans started discussing with the Germans, you know, about the future of NATO. And they planted this thought that NATO would be better off and Europeans would be better off if the former Warsaw Pact countries could be brought into the NATO and a new kind of NATO configuration could be made. When the Russians came to know about it, Yeltsin, who was very keen on amity with the Western world, he protested furiously. And but the Americans, Clinton had a wonderful relationship with him, but he was not a strong man. You have heard about Yeltsin, his idiosyncrasies. So the West, the Americans could get him to accept it, to put it succinctly. And in 1997, overruling the Russian protests, NATO expanded, violating the assurance given to Russia. Yeltsin pointed out that you had given us this assurance that you wouldn't do this. In fact, even in the American side, you're already familiar with the name of George Kennan. The Clinton people, Stuart Talbot in particular, sounded out various Russia hands in America and in the Western world. Uniformly, the advice was, don't do this, because this is of fundamental importance, the assurance that was given to Russia, which facilitated the ending of the Cold War, and this sort of a tension-free relationship between Russia and the Western world. Don't do this because you'll be upending everything. In fact, Kennan said that this will be a geopolitical catastrophe. That was his description of it. He said that if you do this, take it that you will never be able to have a normal relationship with Russia. Its history, its security concerns, everything taken into account, Russia can never accept this. Don't do this. But it was overruled by the hardliners in Washington and the entrenched Cold Warrior mindset in the American psyche. You can call it Russophobes or whatever. But 1997, the first expansion took place. And then immediately after the first expansion took place in 1997, NATO attacked Yugoslavia, which was absolutely terrible, because this is the first invasion of a foreign country by NATO. You know, when we speak about the American propaganda today about Ukraine, do not forget that for 78 days, continuously, the NATO planes bombarded Yugoslavia, razed Belgrade to the ground, and including even the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, with no regard for civilian life or casualty or anything of that sort. This is NATO's own track record. And then they dismembered Yugoslavia. And the unspoken reality Russians understood is a message also to Russia that this is another Slavic nation belonging to the Russian Orthodox Church, that the family of the Eastern Church, and we are dismembering it, and there is nothing you can do about it. This is the kind of message that was given to Russia in that event in 1999. Why? Because after knowing about the NATO expansion, Yeltsin reached out to China for an understanding. And that famous treaty of his visit to China and all that, in the famous treaty of 1995-96 is an offshoot of that. The growing disenchantment in the Russian mind about Western American intentions towards it. Then in waves, the NATO continued to expand, and every stage Russia opposed it and made remarks that don't do this, you are coming closer to our country. And then came this coup, which was virtually a coup, which took place in 2014, when Yanukovych was willing to step down. Yanukovych was by no means a pro-Russian figure, but Americans wanted a completely pro-American figure. In fact, Yanukovych's election campaign was handled by an American company, paid American company. So that was Viktor Yanukovych. But even that was not sufficient enough for the Americans, because they had an agenda already towards Russia. And for that, they need a very pliable regime in Kiev. And that was the quintessence of the coup. When Yanukovych offered to step down, Germany, France, Poland negotiated that deal. And the assurance given to Yanukovych was that you hold a election, midterm election, and have a new government which can decide about NATO's, about European Union's. NATO was never a factor there, because it was written into the Ukraine constitution that it was not possible. But European Union membership. So he agreed to that. Then in the next 2 days, a coup took place there, 48 hours. And this lady who's coming to Delhi tomorrow, Victoria Nuland, has been caught on camera at the city square distributing sandwiches to these protesters. It is a recorded fact, and they have acknowledged it, that she was a participant in that turbulence in Kiev. It's the lady who's coming here. So we must remember that all these, have a lot of background, which, both Indian academics and your important opinion makers and students who are going to apply the better part of their life to this topic of geopolitics should be cognizant of, So you see, Victoria Nuland was a participant there, and her remarks were recorded on camera. And you know what she said? If you know that word, that four-letter word, Europe, we will do what we like. She's been caught on camera saying that to the protesters. We will do what we like. And then she mentioned that this is the person that will put in power in Kiev. These are all on record on camera. Imagine that. Russians had no role in it. And the subsequent events stemmed out of it. Crimea, Donbass, everything stemmed out of it. So you see, the issues today are not really Ukraine, not really the question of national sovereignty, not really the question of, if it is a question of national sovereignty, Yugoslavia should have remained intact. The Western world carved it into 6 nice little states, isn't it? So national sovereignty was never an issue. The invasion of Iran and Afghanistan should never have taken place. The later NATO attack on Libya should never have taken place. All these things. Human rights is also not the issue, because if human rights is the issue, how many people died in Yugoslavia? And in Iraq, over 3 lakhs people died. And in Libya, around 2 lakhs. And in Afghanistan, around 1 lakh. And in Yemen, the carnage is still continuing, and it has exceeded, it has come to close to 2.5 lakhs. And it is still continuing, where the Americans are involved in it. So you see, these are issues, which have been brought into it to confuse the international opinion, because most countries are sensitive about the question of national sovereignty. And most countries are sensitive about human casualty and conflict situations. So to build up a kind of opinion, they have obfuscated the real issues and have brought this to the fore. This must be clearly understood. What is at stake here from Russian point of view, as Professor Girish Kumar rightly put, if NATO comes to Ukraine, and the preparations were already at an advanced stage, the Russian intelligence came to know about it, and that they were going to they were planning to formalize it by the NATO summit in June in Madrid this year. So it was at that point that the Russians, gave the warning to the West that we have no space. Putin said, we have no space to back off. We are with our back against the wall. And he said, you are holding a dagger at our throat. What did it mean? It meant that this place where the Indian students were, Kharkiv was being prepared close to the Russian border as a place, as a missile site. And from there, Putin said that a missile fired from there could hit Moscow and St. Petersburg within 5 minutes, giving hardly any reaction time. Forget about second strike capability. And then in NATO's doctrine, Russia is an enemy. They have designated Russia as an enemy. And in the American national defense strategy, they have incorporated a new fact to cover up future events. They have said they have reserved the right for preemptive action against any power that they deem to be adversarial. Preemptive action, even if they don't get attacked, they reserve the right to attack with nuclear weapons. And then, so you see cumulatively, the kind of threat that developed on Russia's doorsteps was absolutely formidable. It had no background. It had no precedent. So this was the time that the Russians in the mid-December, they gave this warning that if you go on this track, we will resist, because this is existential issue for us. This is about national defense. And the future, of course, if the NATO had come into Ukraine, Russia would have to resign itself to a subaltern role in world politics. And Russia would have to comply with American diktats on several areas, and they will have to play a secondary role. And a great power like Russia is not willing to do that. So you know, the issues here are of a kind that, first of all, number one point is of a kind that the world opinion in terms of the liberal ideology, which is malleable, which can be interpreted this way, that way, depending on the Western interests, will not influence Russia. Its actions today on the ground. Its actions have very specific objectives. Russia cannot afford to have an anti-Russian regime, in a puppet regime of the Western world, of the Americans, right on their doorstep. They could live with NATO countries which previously belonged to Warsaw Pact, but this is bringing matters, and I don't need to narrate the Russian history starting from the early 18th century, the Swedish invasion of Russia. This is a very famous invasion route, and if you travel in that area, you will find very flat plains, and Carpathian mountains on the southern extreme apart. It's a very flat plain, ideal, and how fast the Nazi army drove through that area and came into Russia, today's Russia. So you see, all these security considerations, and security considerations for most nations, even for Americans. If somebody were to do this in Mexico, I'm very sure the Americans wouldn't allow it. And in the case of Cuba, we know that they said nothing doing, even if it's World War, we won't allow it. So you see, for a great power, it's very difficult to do what the West was demanding, which is Russia's capitulation. Now, therefore, the situation today is, in my assessment, more or less, now this has got a lot of implications on the geopolitical plane. In my assessment, the Russians have more or less met with their objectives. I don't want to get into details here. My article is coming in the Tribune newspaper tomorrow, where I have written about this, the alchemy of this operation as such. So if anyone is interested, you can see that tomorrow. I'll post it on the Facebook also. So, Russian objectives are very clear-cut. It is not the conquest of Ukraine. It is not territorial annexation. It is not occupation. It is to roll back the NATO-American grip on that country. So the underpinnings that are going to be given to a settlement are quite clear, that what they are demanding is Ukraine should remain a neutral country. This means Ukraine will not be a part of the CIS or the Eurasian Economic Union or SCO or any such thing. It should simply remain a neutral country, neither ours nor yours. This kind of a neutral country. A similar status which Austria enjoys. You know the history there. Stalin's army went up to the gates of Austria and then chose not to enter and came back. And Austria declared itself neutral. Finland, the same thing happened. So a similar kind of a arrangement with regard to Ukraine is what this doesn't mean that Ukraine cannot be part of Europe, that it cannot take membership of the European Union or anything. But what Russia is ensuring is that it will not have a cutting edge toward Russia by deploying weapon systems, NATO weapon systems on its soil in particular, and by giving Russia a certain degree of strategic depth. Because as it is, conventional forces, NATO enjoys big superiority over Russia. Russia has excellent weapon systems which NATO cannot match. But in sheer strength, in a continental war, NATO is far superior. What balances it is its thermonuclear capability and its doctrine that if it is ever attacked, or its state disintegrates due to a foreign attack, then it reserves the right to use nuclear weapons. So that is a very big factor in giving us the underpinning for Russian security. So you see, the neutralization of Ukraine is very much on the cards. That is what we should be looking for. Zelensky is a puppet of the Americans. And Zelensky's history also, as you know, he was an ex-comedian. His history also is that, he has no political base in that country. The rest, what is taking place is actually theatrics. He can appear on TV because he is a TV star, and he's a good performer, and he appears every day in recorded video cameras from wherever he is. He appears in front of us, and that sets the dialogue in the period ahead, the next few hours. So I don't know whether he will make a reliable, steady interlocutor for Russia. I don't think it is possible because he doesn't have that kind of a material in him. And Ukrainian domestic politics is in a flux. And there are forces, freewheeling forces, which are behind the scenes, which are very powerful. Sometimes you can call them even a state within the state. These right extremists, far right extremist forces with fascist tendencies, called the Azov Brigade, which is now holding fort in Mariupol in southern Russia, where the fighting is broken out since yesterday. So you see, this is the kind of scenario that is there. Therefore, now I will briefly talk about India's 5 minutes, 6 minutes, I'll talk about it, and I don't need to explain India's predicament. Now that we all understand and we all agree that this is not about Russia and Ukraine, that this is about a great power confrontation, which has immense potentials for the configuration of the 21st century geopolitics and the world order. There is very little role for India in this, And like the African proverb says, when two elephants fight, it is the grass which gets trampled on, So first of all, we need to, what the government is doing, and I think the government has handled this admirably, almost optimally, under the circumstances, like even the Japanese Prime Minister tried to, push our Prime Minister towards the Western position. And from what I see, so far, from what I understand, I am in Trivandrum, so I don't know. But from what I understand, and I'll talk to people, whether there is more to it than meets the eye. But I don't think so, because I think Prime Minister Modi is very clear-headed in his understanding that the relationship with Russia is of pivotal importance for India. And he has a wonderful personal friendship, like he doesn't probably enjoy with any other world leader, with Putin. And there is always, an access for him in an emergency concerning Indian security interests or Indian requirements. So I cannot imagine, I might not have this confidence in previous governments in India, but I do have that confidence, 100% confidence, that when it comes to Russia, Prime Minister Modi will not be forgetful. The second question is, now that this confrontation is evolving and it is coming to a head and one side has to win, and in my opinion, let us wait and see. In my opinion, Russia has already won, and that is the meaning of this big triumphal event in Moscow on Friday evening, when close to 1 lakh people gathered in Luzhniki Stadium. It was a victory celebration. Because the point is, for Russia, it is an existential struggle. For the West, it is a geopolitical event. And you can imagine that fatigue sets in the second quarter at some point or the other. America is 10,000 kilometers away. And for Europeans, the priorities are different. The priorities are not about war, about refugees, about extremism appearing on their continent. It is a well-manicured, peaceful continent, prosperous continent. And they're just emerging out of the pandemic, and their priority is on post-pandemic economic recovery. And they have also good relations, working relations with Russia. But in the context of this, since it is a juxtaposition between Russia and the Western alliance system, Russia and the United States, they have been very loyal to their commitment to the Western alliance system. They have joined ranks there. But if you are a perceptive observer, and if you monitor the remarks that are coming out every day from places like Berlin or Paris or Rome or places like that, major European powers, you will sense that undercurrent of disquiet. Because this sort of a confrontation for Europe is not helpful. And for a country like the most powerful country in the European system, Germany, is something like 40 to 50% of the gas supplies, 40% definitely, comes from Russia. They cannot do without the Russian market. It is a locomotive of growth for the German export industry. So all these are realities, and France also knows that. So, and Germany knows that, the importance of having friendly relations with Russia, the backlog of the Second World War and all that taken into account. So this alliance system, European alliance system, is going to assume new features in the aftermath of this conflict. Now, therefore, the world that India will encounter is going to be a very strange environment for India. I mentioned about it that on the specific issue of the centrality of the relationship with Russia, there is absolutely no confusion here. Now, what will happen is, when this confrontation takes newer form in the world order, for India, energy requirements are very big and will only get bigger as time goes, as the economy picks up in the coming years. It's going to be a huge guzzler of energy. And we cannot do without Russia for our energy security. And secondly, the weapon systems, 60 to 70% of the weapon systems are of Russian origin. And more than that, with all this bonhomie, we call Americans natural allies and so on, they never give us high technology. They don't transfer high technology even to their closest allies, let alone India. Whereas we get, the Russians give us high technology weapons. And which country in the world today will be prepared to let us use their nuclear submarines? Only 3 countries have nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines. 3-4 countries have nuclear submarines, including China. But how do we operate? How do we come to know about nuclear submarines? Because of the lease with the Russians. They continuously, for the past decade, they've been giving us. They are the only countries which are willing to transfer technology to us, which are willing to go into co-production with us. So, for defense imperatives are on the supreme for any country. So I don't see any trouble on that sphere. And Indian diplomacy is astute enough to handle sort of bullying and pressure tactic from other quarters. After all, When we violated the territorial integrity of Pakistan in 1971, this is not the first time that the territorial integrity of another country has been violated, by the way. So it happened in 1971. We had no one with us in the UN Security Council except Russia. And the entire community in the UN General Assembly condemned us. We were alone. But we did that because it is important for the national security interests. And we did that. And then we overcame that successfully. And one pillar of strength we had was the Russian friendship. So, these are things, which are, there is an institutional historical memory in our establishment, in the foreign policy establishment. Therefore, the kind of excitement with which this is discussed in the media and so on here is unreal. There is a disconnect. The reality there is different. I can assure you, having been part of the system for 3 decades, I can tell you the realities are different. They are aware of the imperatives of national security, national defense, India's economy, its priorities, and so on. Ruling a country like India, they have to be, aware of all these compulsions. So I have no worries on that score. The question is, how do we navigate this new world that is taking place? I mentioned to you that I don't see that the United States can accept this defeat, because this defeat will lead to the unraveling of the Western alliance system. Because Europeans at some point or the other, in a very near future, within months, or already the thought is there in their mind, we see from occasional references, why did this have to happen this way? If, after all, it is possible for Ukraine to agree to be a neutral country, why did the Americans put a spoke in the wheel and resist it and insisted that no, NATO shall go wherever it likes? And there's no question of Ukraine not being part of NATO. Nobody can give an assurance when Ukraine is willing to give that assurance. So, all these thoughts, troubling thoughts, will come up, and that will put stress on the Western alliance system. So you see, the effort that is taking place today has got a subplot, and it's a situation where the subplot is sometimes more important than the main plot. And the subplot is, in this case, is also the Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, with this defeat in the Eurasian continent, with this kind of a situation developing there, Russia challenging and winning, this will cast its shadow, certainly, in the Indo-Pacific region. And, the phone conversation between Xi Jinping and Biden called him on Friday evening, as many of you would know. And the subsequent Chinese commentaries and so on have made it very clear that there is no daylight possible between China and Russia in terms of their strategic partnership. So they will not probably, Russia doesn't want any weapons from China anyway. They will not probably give any kind of support in that kind of direction. But short of that, they will not align with the Western world. The Biden's whole attempt was to see if China can be weaned away. And that is not going to happen. So you see, in the Asian continent, it is left with Japan. And Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Delhi shows that they are aware of their loneliness in that region, because ASEAN has taken a neutral stance. So it's going to be a very fluid situation in Indo-Pacific. China, the world acknowledges, is finding itself to be in a much stronger position than ever before in modern history. And it has a capability to withstand American diktats today. And a containment of China is no longer going to be possible. And China itself is openly discussing about the implications of this for Taiwan. So you see, these are the kind of things that we should be looking at. And India has profound choices to make. Now, I will end with this, but let me tell you that it's no less important that the route of weaponization of dollar that America has taken is about to boomerang. And the best example of this is Saudi Arabia's discussions with China to switch to yuan currency for their oil trade. And if you know the history of the dollar, you know that in the early 70s, from gold to dollar, from gold to acceptance of dollar as the world currency, the world agreed on the basis of the American promise that dollar would be made available freely to the rest of the world. And that was the basis of the world's international communities. International community means not the Western world, but the world communities. Acceptance of the dollar as the world currency. Now, then the United States has started using this as a weapon, geopolitical weapon, by sanctioning countries and preventing them from having access to the dollar. Now, things have come to a head when it came to Russia. They therefore have frozen the central bank accounts. That is Russia's money, central bank accounts. They are denying access to the central bank accounts, but they will selectively give access provided their interests are to be fulfilled. For example, there is a debt repayment due now for $160 million Eurobond. And for that purpose, the Russians contacted the Citibank. And lo and behold, the Citibank cleared that because the payment is to be made to American investors, the interest payments. So you see, Americans are very good in looking after their interests. But this weaponization of the dollar, why is Saudi Arabia perturbed about it? Why is the UAE gravitating towards Russia in such a pronounced way as it is happening now? It is all because a lot of countries are watching this with great disquiet. Its implications for them. If tomorrow they have a tension with the United States can do the same thing to them, because all these oil-rich countries have kept their money in dollar in American banks, and they can be made paupers overnight. Russia is a country with enormous resources to survive this, and survive they will. But what about smaller countries? So, these are the kind of choices that in terms of foreign policy and so on, where it really hurts Indian interests, we need to look at. And now, therefore, the kind of rupee-ruble trade reappearing, and the offer, say, from Iran day before yesterday, that they are willing to have a rupee-real framework. Now, this will have very big influence. And I think that this is what will worry the Americans and what should worry the Americans, because the trade in minerals is fundamental to the status of the world order. And when that is affected and countries begin to trade in non-dollar currencies, then there is going to be a diminution. How does it reflect on American interests? It is by virtue of the world currency, the dollar status as world currency, that America is the only country in the world which doesn't have to worry about inflation. It can just print notes without creating assets to balance it, a basic fundamental economic principle. Now, it has to then be very careful. It cannot fight wars because it cannot print notes and spend and fund a war. It cannot live beyond its means. And the present level of indebtedness, it's a hopelessly indebted economy, ultimately, by the way. That kind of a indebtedness is not going to be sustainable. So this actually can be a dagger at the prosperity of the American economy itself, if these privileges get affected. So, when we look at this theater, that is in front of us, please look at it in terms of its fundamental consequences, in terms of the fact that China's rise is now inevitable. China's supremacy, rather, as the number one world power is going to be inevitable. Number two, the Western alliance system is going to take newer forms. Number three, the primacy of the dollar as the world currency. These are the issues that we need to look at when we weigh the foreign policy consequences of what is taking place today in Ukraine. Thank you.